One in four people has a genetic susceptibility to become addicted to any substance. And we don't know who those people are in advance. Maybe someday we'll have a test for it so we can warn those people not to ever experiment. She's got the suburban home and her Range Rover and her 3 kids that she doesn't have to work because her husband is successful. And she was using, to get through her day, whippets of nitrous oxide. And then I see her again, 6 months later in the hospital. And by now she's got devastating damage to her spinal cord and dementia. We can get really, really busy and busy ourselves with all kinds of things to avoid something, but it's not helping you heal. You're not healing when you're doing that. You have to stop. You have to stop and process and listen. And in any way that you can do that, if you can have the luxury of being able to take some time off and do that, go back to nature, do something where you're not keeping your brain busy, it will allow to some extent those feelings to come up to consciousness.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Broken Beautiful Me, where we gather in this sacred space for honest conversations and soul deep healing. I am so lucky today to have as my guest Dr. Carolyn Taylor. Carolyn is a seasoned neurologist who's dedicated over 3 decades to the practice of medicine. A graduate of the University of Notre and Hahnemann Medical College, she completed a neurology residency at the University of Pennsylvania, where she was awarded the Humaneness in Medicine Award and recognized as one of Philadelphia's top docs for women. She recently published Whispers of the Mind, a neurologist's memoir, a collection of deeply personal and professional medical essays. Dr. Taylor lives in Bellingham, Washington. Welcome, Carolyn. It's so nice to have you here.
Thank you. I'm very honored to be here.
As a neurologist, you have witnessed the extraordinary resilience of the human brain. What has surprised you most about how we heal, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually?
Oh, that's quite a question. What has surprised me most? Mm-hmm. I think the enormous capability that we have, the enormous resilience of the human spirit. And I would say spirit. It's the spirit that drives us, I think, to do certain things. And I think time and time again, it's been shown that people with a positive attitude, people that are grateful, people that try to give back, are people that do better, they heal better, they can surmount illness better, whether it is a scientific thing that helps your immune system or just a spiritual thing. I like to think it's both. I've seen in my career just enormous, I've gotten enormous inspiration from these people with ALS, people with brain tumors, people with all kinds of disease, that Parkinson's disease, dementia, that somehow rise to the occasion and make the best of whatever they have. And these people are happy people, and they're inspiring people. So I think it doesn't surprise me any longer, but in my career, watching these people along the way, and actually in neurology, we don't cure many people because a lot of what we deal with are neurodegenerative diseases. Some people we can certainly manage and help, and the migraine patient, for instance, a person with epilepsy, that you can treat their seizures. But a lot of the patients that you will encounter as a neurologist are people that go on this path of neurodegeneration, and they know what's happening. The ALS patient, for instance, or the Parkinson's disease patient, for instance, or someone with early dementia. And it's been such a privilege for me to be able to walk with them on that journey and encourage them along the way and do whatever I can to help them palliatively live their best life because they are going to live probably a long time, maybe, well, 5 to 10 to 15 years. And that's a long time. And you can't dismiss these people. You just have to help them and answer their questions. I think when patients have a terminal illness or if they have a pretty devastating neurodegenerative disease, people that don't know very much about those things tend to avoid talking about it. They kind of tiptoe around it, and it's very uncomfortable for the patient because they have a need to talk. And I usually caution patients at the very beginning, don't talk about it too much to people that don't understand the disease unless they're open minded, because they'll start telling you things that they know from the media or somebody they knew way back when that had this and they died or they were in a wheelchair. I said, that's going to scare you until you understand your own disease and are confident in that knowledge so that people don't upset you. And then you can just educate them. But when they come to see their neurologist, they can talk about it. They can ask all their questions and they can tell you their stories. And so I just enjoy spending time with people. I enjoy the connection, the human connection. And that's what is so wonderful about neurology compared to surgery, for instance, where you go in, you fix somebody and you're gone. I went into this, into this for the human connection.
That's beautiful. So tell me about the decision to write this book and tell our audience a little bit about what's between the cover.
Okay, well, it is throughout my career, beginning, I think, in medical school, um, probably sooner than that, I would do it on occasion. I would journal. Um, I love to sit down and write, and I was, busy pursuing a career, so I didn't do much with it. But when I encountered a difficult situation, because you just, in medicine, especially in training, you have to just keep going. I would sit down and write about it. And that was how I processed my thoughts. That's how I dealt with my own grief and sorted out my own emotions. And so I did this. I found that I was doing this more and more when I would encounter a very, very sad case, or I'd get to know a patient in the hospital and they would die. And of course, I would write about it. And then every once in a while, there's something wonderful or something funny that would happen, and I would write about it because I didn't want to forget it. So in this book, when I semi-retired after many years and um, going through a stressful period in my life, I decided I need to take some. Finally, I need to take some time and reflect. I sat down and I read through this journal, and I could see my own transformation over the 30 years, but I also saw such inspiring stories. I decided I would try to put it into a literary form, and I published them as individual essays. So each essay stands alone, but I start the essays in medical school, and you can see internship, residency, and then later and later in practice. So there's stories about most common neurologic diseases, a few unusual ones, but you don't have to understand neurology. I put it in layman's terms. The story is really about the person, the and the family and how they dealt with things, and to some extent how that affected me as a physician. So I included in there 3 isolated events that occurred, actually 4 in my life, that had to do with neurologic illness, but had to do with that were a personal nature. The death of my mother, the assisted death of my father, who I had been estranged from for 26 years, the death of my brother, who died of a devastating stroke in his 50s. And then I had my own diagnosis of cancer. I'm fine. but um, it's the gaslighting chapter about medical gaslighting and how women are particularly subjects of that. Women, elderly, obese people, and it's a cultural thing. It's not done on purpose, but it's I think it's mostly cultural. But it even happened to me as a physician from another woman physician, told that my symptoms were just stress and she's not going to do another biopsy. And so only because I had this feeling that, something's not right here. I don't believe I've been stressed my whole life to some degree. What's so different now that I took myself to somebody else? And only because of that, I had a stage 1 diagnosis. But had I waited the year she suggested, I wouldn't be here talking to you today. So there's something for everybody in there. And I do talk. Also, I have maybe 4 or so individual, completely different stories that have to do with addiction in people I encountered. A frequent thing that neurologists encounter, I mean, often we're called in to do the brain death consult when someone is overdosed, or to give a prognosis. Are they going to wake up? Are they having seizures? What's going on? And I, as a neurologist, I truly believe addiction is a brain disease, and it's very misunderstood and stigmatized. And I think we need to educate people to take that stigma away so people can get the help they need and the understanding and compassion that they need and deserve.
Yeah, I before we, because I do want to hear just some examples of the different stories of your patients. But before we pressed record, you described the brain of a young person and addiction, and I'm just wondering that cement reference, if you could speak to our audience about that, because I thought it illustrates addiction in such a way that is very easy to understand that it's a brain disease.
Good, good. Um, 1 in 4 people has a genetic susceptibility to become addicted to any substance. And we don't know who those people are in advance. Maybe someday we'll have a test for it so we can warn those people not to ever experiment. But when it happens, especially in a developing brain, the brain of a male, for instance, doesn't fully develop. And we're talking about the prefrontal cortex that controls impulse control until they're about 26. And a woman's brain will develop a little earlier, maybe around the age of 23, with some variability. So as the brain is still developing and maturing, those neural pathways aren't completely set yet. So I like to use the example of wet cement. So think of the brain as gooey wet cement, and those neural pathways are working, but they're not completely set. And if you expose a brain during that critical time to alcohol, drugs, um, anything of that nature, I suppose even something like gambling, which stimulates the whole dopamine reward circuit system. But a teenager's not that likely to start gambling, but they are going to experiment in many cases with drugs, with alcohol, or they get put on a drug for a medical reason. Um, 3 out of 4 can get off of that drug, but that one can't. And what happens is you are forming those reward circuit pathways for the drug so that that individual will crave that drug above anything else. That drug will be more important to them than food and water and sex and um, protecting, shelter. They will That will supersede everything else in the reward pathway. So they crave it, they need it. There's a circuit that goes to the memory part of the brain that even years after someone has been sober, 8, 10 years, they can see something or smell or hear something that triggers a memory that will start that reward circuit pathway all over again because they loop together, which is why it's so risky to relapse. But the problem with the developing brain is you now have these aberrant neural pathways to crave that substance that gets set in the cement. And then the brain's matured, but those pathways never change. They're there for good. And it is so critical that we protect our children. You don't hear too often of someone getting addicted to something later in life if they weren't addicted earlier. There's a lot more help because those pathways have been set correctly than there is for the young developing brain. And that's when it is so very tragic. And we need to understand, and they don't, I mean, nobody has ever come to me and said, I wanted to be an addict. Nobody wants to be an addict. They don't want this. They hate it. They hate the things they do when they're under the influence of it. They hate how much it's hurt their family, but they cannot help it. Um, it's just the nature of the disease. And that's what makes it so challenging for a physician who's dealing with the patients. I come in contact with them for all kinds of reasons. And I talk about this in the book. I had a young man that I took care of, just devastating MS. And he did extremely well. We got him on these aggressive drugs. He was a marathon runner and bicyclist. And at one point, he was a completely quadriplegic from a spinal cord injury. And he recovered to a great degree and was back doing things. But in the course of this, he got placed on muscle relaxants and eventually Valium-like drugs, which is probably one of our best relaxants. And he was one of the 1 in 4. And he was at that critical age. And no matter what he did over the rest of his life, he couldn't get away from that. He would keep relapsing into, oh, I've got such spasms. I need this drug. And finally, he's married, doing well, talking about having a child. And the specialist that was trying to treat this addiction put him into a rehab. And I saw him the day he got out, and he was so happy. And he and his wife were making plans, and his MS was doing great. We went over his films, and he said, I'll see you in 6 months, as he walked out the door. And I got a call the next day from his wife that she found him overdosed. He had some pills that he'd stored away, and he couldn't sleep. And right out of rehab, he couldn't not resist. But he hadn't had any drugs for a month. And so he took a dose that he typically could tolerate, and now he could no longer tolerate it, and he was dead. So, that's one example. I would be called in to see young people, teenagers, very young adults that had overdosed from a variety of drugs, and then trying to deal with the families afterwards that just they had lost their child so many times. Every time they go out and use drugs, and they'd have to find where he was and pick him up out of the streets and get him in rehab. And, when they go through this so many times, I had one family, and I wrote about it, that just refused to come in and see him. And this was particularly difficult for me because he looked like my son, who was just about that age. And you see this beautiful young man lying there unconscious. And he was coming back. His EEG showed that he had some brain activity. So I thought, well, we're going to get him back. We're going to get him back. And I had the final call with his parents in the morning after dealing with this all night. And I said, the EEG looks like there's some brain activity. Are you, will you come in? And they said no. And after they said no, it's almost like you could almost imagine that he was floating above us and could hear it, And then I went back in, and his pupils dilated, and he then became brain dead. And it was just so sad. But I understood what they had been through all those years. I really, really did. But I understood too that this boy couldn't help it, that this is a disease, a terrible, terrible disease. So compassion, taking away the stigma, is very critical. I talk in an essay about another young woman who looks like she has everything. She's got the suburban home and her Range Rover and her 3 kids that she doesn't have to work because her husband is successful, and she can go to their soccer games and do all the things with your child that a mother would want to do. And I was jealous of her because I was working so much and struggling to get to my son's athletic events, and every time I would get there, it was so wonderful because I couldn't go to all of them. And she was using, to get through her day, whippets of nitrous oxide. And it came to my attention because she had tingling sensations, and totally denied anything was wrong, but she was deficient in B12. And we got her supplemented, but one of the causes of that can be nitrous oxide use. And I asked her about it, and she's total denial. And she wasn't the typical person you'd think would be addicted, and not to something like that. And I don't know how it came about, but she was um, using incredible amounts. And no matter how much I counseled her, she wouldn't allow her family to know, her husband or anybody. She said, I've got this under control. And then I see her again, 6 months later in the hospital. And by now she's got devastating damage to her spinal cord and dementia, because it's an essential vitamin for the peripheral and the central nervous system. And, but again, and she knew this could happen, but she could not use this, not without help, not without help. So help is very important, and understanding. And there's this big thing about enabling. And, there's one train of thought that says, school of thought, that says, you can't kick them out. Don't help them anymore. Don't put them in rehab again, because you have to teach them that this behavior is unacceptable. And they know it's unacceptable. That's the challenge. They can't help it. And so I'm not in that school of thought. I'm in the school of thought, help them understand, get them into rehab, do an intervention, watch them really carefully when they get out of rehab, because a month is not enough. It's not enough. It's enough to get the drugs acutely out of the system, but it's not enough for the brain to heal enough to not go right back out there and use whatever they can find. So it's a real problem. It's a real problem in our country, and I imagine in other countries as well. But our country is, I think we're flooded with too many drugs, and the drugs that are coming into the country that are tainted with, contaminants, or very, very large doses of something like fentanyl. And there's a new drug circulating in Europe right now, which is even worse than fentanyl, that hasn't hit the United States yet, but it surely will, that drugs are getting contaminated with. But it's always a street drug. Even counseling these young people to not use street drugs um, is important. But I've had some good stories. I just told you a few devastating stories, but I've had a few good stories where people got the help and um, could stay off of drugs for a considerable period of time. I think if you can get somebody through this for a year and a half, maybe 18 months, there will be some healing of the brain. It doesn't completely, you know, re those pathways don't completely reorient, but we know there's more plasticity to the brain than we used to think. So I'm forever hopeful, and that there's new, emerging things. Even these weight loss drugs they talk about now, they've been so wonderful. They seem to be helpful with addiction, and they're just starting to study that.
Oh, how interesting.
With the cravings, yes, because it has to do somewhat with the dopamine reward system.
Yeah.
Because when people get addicted, they essentially deplete their dopamine system. They get such a rush of too much dopamine, and it damages those receptors. So the dopamine receptors, so that when you take that away, and they try to get through life without the drug, they don't feel normal, because those dopamine receptors are so damaged that they need the drug just to feel normal, not high anymore, but just normal. So there's a lot of damage that takes place. And I don't know, it's a difficult situation. There's drugs like methadone and Suboxone, buprenorphine, that will go in and they're agonists, or they stimulate the receptors that the drug was stimulating without getting the person high. And they work, but they're not without side effects themselves. So I don't have the answer, but my message to parents out there is to, and um, loved ones of addicts, is to understand and learn as much as you can. Um, the Betty Ford Center, Hazleton, has a wonderful, wonderful program for families that they can attend for a week and learn as much as you can about addiction, to try to walk that fine road between compassion and helping and enabling or not enabling, and to understand and try to get that loved one the help that they need. And parents to be as vigilant as they can, as their kids are growing up. And when they really need that vigilance is middle school, high school, and college, certainly. But a lot of this starts in high school.
Mm-hmm. Um, just to go back to, you were talking about rehab. What would you like to see as the next step after someone gets out of rehab? Because, oh, hello.
This is Darby.
Darby, it's so nice to have you on the podcast.
Darby. He's a Bernese Mountain Dog. And when
Oh,
he comes in for a hug, you just have to hug him because he's so big.
I have a Labrador Retriever that is massive as well, and yeah, he kind of once he's coming in, there's no stopping him.
No stopping him, no. Oh, he's laying down now. He's good. He just had to say hello to everybody.
Well, I'm so glad that he did. But if you could create something for when the time period when someone comes out of rehab, and it is so they've been in rehab even for 6 months, and what do you think we should be working on to support people who come out of rehab so that to keep them going? Like what should we be doing that we're not doing now?
Well, there's something called a sober house that ideally someone coming out of rehab will then go right into the sober house. And it's a group of people that are out of rehab so they all can understand one another and they're responsible to one another to stay sober. And they are still tested to be sure that they're free of drugs. They can come and go, they can go to work. They come back there, but they live there and they eat there. And they're there for a period of time. Some people will remain there for a year, some people a month or two, but it bridges that time span. The problem I'm seeing right now is and it's going about to get much worse, little money appropriated for mental health, and um, substance addiction is a mental health diagnosis that I think a lot more people are going to fall through the cracks here because these programs all take money and support, and Medicaid is important for this. And a lot of people are going to be targeted with loss of Medicaid unless something happens soon. I think they're trying to get something to happen in this next week to stop the loss of the tax credits so that so many people won't lose their insurance. But I fear for what could happen. It's not enough to stop fentanyl at the borders. You've got to help people that are dealing with addiction, right now.
Right.
So
Because
if you can't afford it, they have to be, and the family isn't ideal to be drug testing their loved ones. And, there's so much that goes back and forth with shame. You don't want to shame these people. That a sober house or a place like that is actually ideal.
Well, I do hope that we can keep things on track and keep people supported. That is, I have a great fear about that as well.
Yeah.
But I really think that our listeners will take so much from the explanation you have provided as a brain disease. I think that's such an important conversation for us as families. There are so many families who are touched by this, and understanding is the most important thing.
It is. It is understanding and compassion and not shaming them. And they really can't help it. And with the life that they're going to live with this chronic disease is it's always going to be there to some extent. Even with remission, there's always that risk, and they need they need a plan. So
Mhm.
when I relapse, all my friends and my family, my wife, everybody has to understand and get me help right away. Um, and have that plan in place. And I think there are people that can live very, very productive lives. I mean, look at Robert Downey Jr.
Absolutely. Oh, that's a great example.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
He had, I mean, he had been basically, if you looked at every magazine cover as you were getting at the checkout for your groceries, the world had kind of written him off.
I
And
know.
he came back from that.
And he was exposed to drugs as a very young adolescent
Yeah.
in his own home, and so that's how that happened to him. And he was even incarcerated for a period of time. And that may have been, I don't know how long he was, but that may have been part of the key of him getting into remission, because maybe that prolonged the period of time he couldn't use drugs. The longer you can go without drugs, the more chance you have to get some healing, to go into a very prolonged um, remission. So if somebody can stay in rehab or a sober house for 6 months, a year ideally, if you add the sober house to it, they have a better chance.
Give me another example of one of your patients that you decided to write about in the book.
I had this beautiful young woman um, who came to me for loss of balance, and she was just beautiful. She looked like an angel. And the I think this title of that essay is Angels Among Us. She was about 27, and she had worked so hard for over a year to lose weight, because she'd always been a little on the heavy side. And she lived with her mother and wanted to get out. She had a good job, wanted to get out on her own and, meet somebody and maybe have a family someday, and just all the wholesome um, things anybody might want to do in life. And she was beautiful, blonde hair, bright blue eyes, and just a radiant personality. And, it was a little alarming. People are a little off balance at that age. You're thinking, the most common thing this could be is MS, but gee, MS isn't so bad, because we have so many wonderful drugs today. And if we get it early, we can really keep someone from disability. So I was really hopeful, because something was wrong. And what bothered me was, oh, and by the way, I'm getting these awful headaches, and I never had headaches before. And that's not so much MS. It turned out she had a brain tumor. And as a general neurologist, I got her into the hands of an excellent neuro-oncologist. And biopsy, and she eventually had it removed. And it was middle grade. It was malignant, but it wasn't highly malignant. It wasn't the glioblastoma that people will ultimately die from. And some of these patients will actually um, go into remission with radiation and chemotherapy and surgery. And she had a pretty good prognosis in the end. Came back to me after all this, and 6 months later, and I was following her monthly at first with MRIs, and everything looked good. It looked good. And I got to know her and I looked forward to her coming in, because she was just such a radiant, happy person. I'd always feel good when I saw her on the schedule, and she would always be at the very end of the day because she'd get her MRI that day, and then we go over it at the end of the day. And so she had met somebody, and her life was going well. She was able to do a tandem walk, one foot in front of the other. She was recovering from the surgery, which had affected predominantly the balance part of her brain. And, she was like one of those happy stories until she wasn't. Um, Came in, and it had been about a year now since she had presented. And we looked at her MRI together, and it looked good. There was no recurrence of tumor. But I could see at the very top of the brain, the spinal cord, there was a bright spot, which is an indication of inflammation. So I had her get a full spine series, and it was just full of metastatic disease, what we call drop mets from the tumor in the brain that had been treated. Now is spinal cord, and that's a devastating um, outcome that can happen with this particular type of tumor in some individuals. And it's really not treatable. She was surely she was terminal at this point and wasn't anything to do. And she was surely only had maybe a few months at most. And I called her up and I said, I want you to come in. I want you to bring your mom. So she knew it was bad. She came in by herself, and she actually was prepared for it. And she was trying to console me because I was upset. And she said, I just want to figure out, I have a short time, how to help my mother get through this. She said, I've got to help my mother. We're all alone in the world. My father left when I was a child. My mother has only me. And her only concern was her mother. And I just thought, I was devastated for her and devastated about the whole thing, but all she cared about was her mother. And it was a beautiful thing, almost as if this spirit knew she was going to go at a young age. But she was a true angel. Um, I had another young man that I just adored. He had Huntington's chorea. Now, Huntington's disease, for people that don't know it, is a genetically inherited disease. It's autosomal dominant. So if you have the gene, 50% of your offspring will get it. And everybody that gets the gene will be affected. But with each generation, the individual gets it at a younger age. So if it's a mutation and you're the first person in the family to get this, you might not develop the symptoms of it till you're 40. And by then you've had your children. So that's the devastating thing. So this was a family where the mother had Huntington's and she had 3 sons. And the father had to deal with the loss of his wife, and the kids had to deal with the loss of her mother. And it's a devastating disease with these abnormal body movements that you can't control. And then you develop a terrible dementia. And you eventually can't move at all, and it's terminal over a course of maybe 5 years. So he had to deal with his wife, and then he had the knowledge that, well, each of my sons has a 50% chance of getting this. Well, all 3 of them got it. And I had the youngest one as my patient, and the oldest son is already died. Next oldest was in an institution, and this young boy had it. And he hadn't developed any dementia yet. So he was fully aware of exactly what was going to happen to him. And of course, the father, can you imagine how devastating it was for the father to have to live through this with his wife and all of his children. And these people, and a new drug had come out, so I was able to help him with the movements for a while and the depression, and I would see him really frequently. And this young man always had a big smile. And the highlight of his visit, and mine too, was at the end of the visit, we had to have a big, big hug. And I always got, like Darby gave me, always got this big hug from him. And his father was just a wonderful, wonderful man. And they spent a couple of days a week at Goodwill volunteering, the two of them, to help others. I mean, here they are, dealing with their own tragedy, and that's what they did. And um, he used to love to surf, and his father used to take him to the ocean in his wheelchair so he could watch other surfers because that gave him, helped him with his memories. And when you see what these people live through and live with, and they know what's coming, and you think, how could anything more devastating happen to them? To even lose one son out of three, but the three of them, but these are resilient people that just are so inspiring with the human spirit that they show you, that it was just wonderful.
Hey guys, Kelly here. I wanted to jump in and let you know that you can find out more about my work by visiting my website at kellybuckley.com, or you can find my books on Amazon. Okay, back to the episode.
I mean, I'm listening to you talk about these wonderful human beings, and what lessons have you learned about grief and grace from the people that you've cared for over the years?
So many lessons. I had a young to me young man, I guess he was in his late 30s, early 40s, who had liked him the moment I met him. He was just one of those people you connect with, and just a charming person. And he worked in the medical field, and his wife worked in the medical field. And he came to me with vertigo, which I thought, end of a day on Friday is going to be it's going to be the inner ear. It almost always is. And it wasn't. I could tell as soon as I saw him and examined him that it was coming from the brain, and it did not look good. And it turned out that this man had some form of encephalitis that could not be treated. Nobody could figure out what was causing it. It appeared to be autoimmune, but nothing that controlled the immune system seemed to control it. I had him at the Mayo Clinic. I had him several academic centers, and everybody came up with, well, we don't know what to do. We can just try to control his symptoms. And in the end, I describe it in detail what this man went through, which was really terrible. He decided on assisted suicide only since he didn't have a diagnosis. He didn't fall under the umbrella of the law for assisted suicide. And he didn't want me to be blamed. So they made up some excuse. We've switched insurance, and we have to get 3 months supply of medication. And would you do this for us and send in the prescription? And his wife asked me, and that's a common thing, instead of a month at a time, this is now an insurance plan. And they lived on one of the San Juan Islands. And for him to just get to my office on a ferry with vertigo and throwing up was excruciating. So I arranged for this. And I came into work on a Monday morning, and I got a call from the medical examiner. And he said, I hate to hit you with this first thing in the morning, but I had to deal with a patient of yours this weekend. And he said, are you sitting down? I said, no, but I will. So he told me this story of this man who called in all his relatives and friends from all over the country. There must have been 25 people at his home. He lived on one of the islands. And they all knew what he was suffering with. And he told them all this was a sanctioned assisted suicide. And he wanted to say goodbye and celebrate his life. And he wanted to film it. And this was before cell phones. So he bought a brand new camera from Best Buy, and one of his cousins was going to film it because he didn't want anybody to be blamed. So he wanted this on film. And so he took the pills that I had prescribed for him, thinking that they were just going to be used for his vertigo. And they were filming it. And in the middle of filming it, the camera broke. So this young man panicked and called Best Buy and said, the camera you just sold us broke in the middle of filming my cousin's suicide. What do I do? What do I do? And the people at Best Buy panicked, and they called the police, and the police called the EMTs and everybody on the island, of course, knew him and knew what he had been suffering with. So they didn't want to run in and resuscitate him. They didn't know what to do. And in the end, he did die a peaceful death, and nobody did rush in until they knew it was too late, because they knew what he had been living with. And he's someone that should have been sanctioned for assisted suicide, but he was protecting me and anybody else from, he didn't even want me to know what he was doing because he didn't want it to affect me. And this was a person just thinking of other people. And his wife understood how much he'd suffered. And so you see people that just in their worst time of their life, they're thinking of others, and they're helping others accept what's going on because they've already accepted it, and they're sure they have some spiritual nature to them, that they're sure there is something on the other side, and that this is just their fate. And it's going to happen to all of us in some form, some way, someday. But to witness this, it forces me to think of my own mortality. And that's a hard thing to do, but I've had to do it over and over again, and I've had to help family members of mine die, um, over and over again. That it's something that I have thought a lot about, and I believe there's something, I don't know what it is, but I believe that our energy goes somewhere, and that my goal in life is to just try to help these people, and in any way that I can. I learned when I was doing my residency, as I was telling you, when I was a third week neurology resident. So I'd done my internship, and I'm in my third week of neurology, and I just love neurology. And it was I was looking forward to going every day, and I was learning, and coming out of internal medicine, we're dealing with GI bleeds and hypertension and different things. I was doing what I really wanted to do. And so those first year is very hospital oriented, because it's a hospital practice. You do an afternoon a week in an outpatient clinic, but it's a lot of strokes and coma and brain trauma, and things of that nature, mental status changes and things. It's just a whole different type of neurology, but it's a lot of intensive care, patients in intensive care. And so I got word that my mother, who I'd just seen was fine, was in the hospital, and um, had been put on a respirator because she had an upper respiratory infection, and she was in an irregular cardiac rhythm. So they put her on a blood thinner, but they expected her to get better with antibiotics. But I'd had a premonition even before she went in the hospital that this was going to happen. And so I, rushed to see her after I finished my duties that day. And she had a great sense of humor. And she had the nurses put a sign above her head that said, "Every day above ground is a good day." It made everybody laugh when they came into her room. And that's the title of this essay. And she communicated to me in writing that she had some abdominal pain. So when I left, I called her doctor and talked to him about it. And he said, "Well, I think she's just bucking the ventilator. But if it'll make you feel better, I'll call a surgery consult tonight." And I said it would make me feel better. So I went home, and I went back to the hospital the next day. And the call came around 10 in the morning. I was called out of rounds that my mother had been found unconscious. She had bled 9 pints of blood into her abdominal cavity, and that's what was happening. That's why she had abdominal pain when I saw her. Surgical consult did come in, but they didn't do any testing. They didn't notice her blood level of her blood thinner of heparin was sky high, and they just gave her morphine. So essentially, they killed her. And she was unconscious. She'd infarcted her brain. She'd infarcted her kidneys. So their kidneys had shut down. And I knew she would never recover. And I knew she didn't want that. She wouldn't want to be kept in a vegetative state. And so, as the only physician in the family, I made the decision not to put her on hemodialysis. And we just, waited for her to die. It took a few days. And she died on a Thursday. We buried her on Saturday, and Sunday I was on call at the hospital. So I got to the hospital and I thought all I need to do is get busy and start to do some consults and then start to think about neurology and I'll be okay. And I'll have to compartmentalize, but if I'm busy, I'll be okay. So my first consult, I saw this elderly man with double vision. I thought for me that I had a lot of training in eyes and this will be easy and I'll get going and I'll be okay and I'll be able to go to the next patient, I had about 13 consults called in already. And so I start to examine him. He starts yelling at me that, I don't want you. I don't want a woman. I don't believe in women doctors. Get me a man. And I said, you're lucky that you've got me because I know more about eyes than in the neuroanatomy of eyes than anybody else in this hospital that could do a consult. I'm the only neurologist. And what do you have against women? And he just, he was yelling at me. And so I yelled back at him because I was angry about my mother dying. Then I was upset that I'd yelled at a patient. And I ran to the nearest restroom and I really started to sob. I couldn't stop crying over everything that I'd been through that week. And I couldn't control myself. I couldn't answer my pager. I couldn't get out of the room. And there was a neurosurgical resident trying to sign his patients out to me who'd been on call the day before because we covered their patients and they covered ours. And he couldn't find me because I wasn't answering my pager. And finally, someone said, well, I think I saw her go that way. And he knocked on the door and I was able to open, tears streaked. I was able to open it and told him what had happened. And he said, oh, go home. He gave me the grace of leaving that day. He said, you should not be here. I'll take call for you. And it was the nicest thing anybody had ever done for me. And I left and I stopped by this man's room to apologize to him and told him why I had yelled at him. And he apologized to me and told me why he had yelled at me. His daughter-in-law is an ophthalmologist and his son isn't as successful as she is, and it always bothered him. So he took that out on me. And so we made peace and I went home and cried all day and all night. And then I was back the next day because you have to in training, you can't just leave. But I was in a fog for the next several months. I was there. I took call. I took care of patients. But I'd see someone in the intensive care and I'd record their vital signs and I'd listen to their heart and lungs and then I'd go to write it in the chart. And then I'd know what patient did I see? Whose chart am I supposed to be looking at? And I have to go back and do it again and then go back and try to write it again. I was really struggling because I was just in such grief. And every patient, every older woman in a ventilator reminded me of my mother. And anybody on a blood thinner, which is common in neurology because we're trying to prevent stroke, reminded me of my mother. And all I wanted to do was leave neurology and leave medicine because they'd killed her. Medicine had killed her. I mean, it was an iatrogenic death. And I almost left. And somehow I didn't, and I got through it. And that intense grief got better, and I found my way back to neurology and stayed. But from that moment on, I was much more compassionate, I think, than I ever would have been with patients and with families. And I didn't see that patient as, even if I just met them when they were in a coma with tubes in them and on a ventilator, I saw them more as someone's mother or someone's wife or someone's husband. And I dealt with the family in just a much more compassionate way, that it was like a gift my mother had given me at the beginning of my career, which is so like her. that I stayed with it. And I'm glad I did. I'm glad I continued on to be a neurologist because um, it was it was the right thing for me. It was what I was meant to do. But that experience so early had just a profound effect on me. And then I had experiences, along the way. And I talk about this in my book. Um, my father left when I was 4 years old, left my mother with 4 children to raise by herself, and we never heard from him again. And so we were very close to my mother. She was a wonderful, wonderful person, and never said a bad thing about my father ever because we were part of him. And I, when I was in medical school, I decided I was going to look him up because I always wanted to know why. And what I really wanted after all these years was him to say he was sorry. That's what I needed. And that's why I looked him up. And I did. And I didn't get it on the phone, and we were going to visit one another. And he tried to explain why he left and whatever. Um, but I got to learn getting to know him over the next 10 years. And it wasn't like a father-daughter relationship. It was like, well, I'd opened up this man's life and I feel responsible. And I got to know him as a person. Um, and I got to care for him. He developed Parkinson's disease afterwards. And he would always, we'd visit for a while every once a year. And then we talked on the phone when we couldn't visit because his Parkinson's got worse. And I was busy with my practice and I had a young son and it was harder. But we would talk, and he had a conversation with me once and asked me, he said, I don't ever want to be in a nursing home. I don't ever want to be kept alive on a feeding tube. If I ever have a stroke, if I'm ever in that situation, I hope you'll help me. Because as a neurologist, you would know how to help me. So I called once and he didn't, and my mother was long deceased at this point. I couldn't reach him. So I called local hospitals and I found out that he had been hospitalized with aspiration pneumonia and protein calorie malnutrition, and a feeding tube had been placed against his will because he wasn't in his right mind with his infection, and he'd been placed in a nursing home. So I could have left it at that, given our history, but I flew out to see him. He was in the Midwest. I was in the Philadelphia area. And he was really so happy I had come. He didn't weigh more than 90 pounds. Because of his Parkinson's, he couldn't swallow. And he was hoping he would just die at home. But someone found him and admitted him to the hospital. So they put in this feeding tube. And he wanted to hear all about my son in Little League and everything everybody was doing, and was just very happy to see me. And then as he was about to drift off, he said, "You remember that conversation we had?" And I said, "I do." He said, "Please help me now." So I did. I talked to his attending physician and told him I was a physician and his daughter, and he was in his right mind, and he was. And I said, we want the feeding stopped, hydration stopped, and hospice, and it was okay to give him morphine. And I knew without hydration, he'd die in about 3 days. But if they were not allowed to use his tube, and that was his choice, that was his choice. And I explained it all to him, and he understood. And we said goodbye, and I went back to the hotel, and I was leaving about 5 a.m, and I went back to his room on my way out. And he reached up and threw his arms around me and whispered, "I love you." And I forgave him. And he still never said he was sorry. But I knew he was sorry. And then a few days later, I got the call that he had slipped into a coma and died in the middle of the night. And it was just like losing him as a child. I felt the exact same loss, like a stab in the heart. But there was forgiveness there, and I knew he was sorry, even though I wanted those words, but I never got. So that's a story of loss and forgiveness, and it's things you learn in life. I'm glad I looked him up. I'm glad I understood him, and the problem was depression. It wasn't that he was a bad person. He was depressed at a time in history when they didn't know how to treat depression, and he thought we'd be better off without him, and we probably were, but we weren't. Um, and so it was a sad story, but a beautiful story. And my mother's story, she was the most positive, radiant light that protected his memory and took care of us. Went to work every day and told us we could be anything we wanted to be, that anything in the world we wanted to be, we were capable of doing it. And I believed her, but she didn't tell us how we were going to do it. So I put myself through college and medical school and did it all on loans and scholarships, and I worked um, and I did it all because she said I could, and I could. But she instilled that in us. You know, all of us went off to college, and we all became something in life, and that was because of her. So that's
What a beautiful thing how parents their belief in you can just propel you forward in so many different ways that you could
yes,
never anticipate.
yes, absolutely.
Yeah,
So
that's
I
so.
was so fortunate to have such a wonderful, wonderful mother that,
She sounds amazing.
yeah,
She does. I want to ask you a question about trauma because I've been reading a little bit about processing trauma and how different people approach it differently. And how can you see? Can you explain to us how trauma manifests in the brain and what science tells us about our capacity to rewire?
hmm. Trauma has a profound effect to the brain. Um, it affects the limbic system, which has to do with our emotions. Um, and there's a connection with the limbic system to the memory center. And in severe trauma, people will actually dissociate and short circuit that and not remember the trauma. It was so severe, but it is still there. Um, Even though they dissociate in the sense that their consciousness, their conscious part of the brain doesn't remember. The subconscious remembers it because it's there, it happened. And it's responsible for things like PTSD, intrusion of memories and thoughts and dreams. And if we don't process trauma on a conscious level, learn to process it on a conscious level. And what I did in my life was I would write it down. That was bringing it to my consciousness and processing it. Some people will see a therapist and they might need hypnosis to bring those events conscious, or some other thing that a therapist might do, EMDR or some other technique. Um, it's going to come out. It's going to come out in some physical way. You can have emotional seizures, what we call pseudo seizures, but or blindness, hysterical blindness. And I've seen just about every manifestation of what we call conversion disorder from a trauma being put into physical symptoms that in my 30 years of practice. And the patient really has those symptoms. They're really having seizures. They're really blind. They consciously can't see. But if you watch them, they don't trip on things because their subconscious sees. It'll protect them. But you've got to bring the trauma to the consciousness to deal with it on a factual basis, like the left side of the brain, the analytic side of the brain has to deal with it, has to understand it and process it. And as part of that, go through the grief in order to heal. And that's, you're rewiring in the sense that you bring those memories to the conscious level where you can process them. And only in processing them can you get rid of those physical symptoms. People have chronic pain. They can have, bizarre neurologic symptoms that I discussed, but um, sometimes they just withdraw and they can become almost like they have a dementia. I talk about a case like that in one of my essays. It's the essay specifically about grief, about this woman who had 6 children, and she was the light of the family and kept everybody together and helped manage her husband's books for his business. And one day, many, many years, her children were grown and her husband finally retired. And she just got up one day and, for all practical purposes, looked like end stage dementia. She couldn't dress. She eventually became nonverbal. She couldn't, remember how to use a microwave, what the stove was for. And she just kind of sat in a window and looked out the window. And they went to lots of different doctors and it looked like dementia, but the markers weren't there. The brain atrophy wasn't there. A lot of things weren't there. And in talking to them a year into this, was there any traumatic event? Was your mom have any psychiatric illness? Was she prone to depression? Anything? Nope. She was the bright one. She kept us all together. And then this adult son said, and it's a good thing too that dad's retired now, because now he can help take care of Tommy because mom can't. I said, who's Tommy? Well, he's our oldest brother. When he was 20, he was in a devastating motor vehicle accident or motorcycle accident, is quadriplegic from the neck down. And she wouldn't allow him to go into a home. She has taken care of him at home all these years. His physical needs, his emotional needs, she took care of this boy, but never got to grieve the loss because she had to take care of him and everybody else. So she couldn't. But when her husband retired and someone she trusted could now take care of Tommy, it hit her. And that was not dementia, that was grief. It was pure grief that had waited some 20 years to actually manifest. And with help, with aggressive psychiatric help, she got better. But she didn't know what it was. Nobody knew what it was. But grief always has to be dealt with. It'll always be there. It'll manifest some way. But trauma has a profound effect on us, on the brain, and we have to process it. So, and there's no timeline. It might take you 6 years to process the grief of a devastating loss, but you have to do it. You have to work through it. And everybody has their own way of doing it. But if you don't make it conscious and face it head on, it'll get you. It'll get you later.
It's funny that you say that. I'm just thinking when I lost my parents when I was in nursing school, and when my son died, I actually grieved them at that point, because when I was in nursing school, I went and they were both alive, and by the time I graduated, they had both passed. And I was young, and I had my son Stephen, and I just had to push it all down, I guess.
Because you have to take care of him, and you have to get through.
Yeah, but when he died, all of this unresolved grief bubbled up. And I was like, okay, well, now it's time that I look at this. And I mean, thankfully for my writing, and we had a very good counselor for our family for that first year that helped work through those kind of unresolved emotions. But it is funny how the brain can just put something away, tuck it away, but it will return. It'll bubble back up.
It will. The brain is protecting you because you have to, there's something that means something to you, you have to do. You can't fall apart. Even if you could fall apart and say, well, I go back to nursing. It's not that easy, but you've
No.
got a young son that
Yeah.
needs you. And so that's going to keep you going. But you will have to deal with it at some point. And postponing it is necessary in some cases. It just is. But
Yeah.
it will come back.
It
And
will.
the brain, processing it in time, you do heal in the sense that the pain is there, but um, you can look at the happy times and be grateful for what you had and what that's allowing you to do now with your life to give back to other people. So, in a sense, your son helped you um, become this person that is reaching out to all these, I mean, thousands and thousands of people that watch your podcast are being helped by the trauma that you lived through and the grief, because that's allowing you to do this now. And my mother helped me grief with my individual patients become a better neurologist. So um, you have to be grateful, and it's kind of paying it forward, and it
It
honors.
is. It does.
Yes,
And it honors your mom.
yes.
Um, you've spoken about the connection between gratitude and neuroplasticity. Uh, can you share a simple practice that shifts your brain to focus on healing?
For me, writing it down processed it and helped me heal. I think some people can get, and I've tried this myself, and I'm not very good at it, but I still try it. Meditation um, can help, and they've done studies with meditation and functional MRIs where they've shown healing, that you activate parts of the brain that it shows that there's some plasticity in the brain because it helps in that way. So I think meditation can, um, for some people, being out in the um, nature is meditative. Some people exercise, swimming, doing yoga. That in that way, they're kind of meditating. They're putting their brain waves in a state that is more meditating, and I think it helps with healing. Um, Everybody's a little bit different, but I think we can all find a way. Um, and it's a way of slowing down. We can get really, really busy and busy ourselves with all kinds of things to avoid something, but it's not helping you heal. You're not healing when you're doing that. You have to stop. You have to stop and process and listen. And in any way that you can do that, um, if you can have the luxury of being able to take some time off and do that, go back to nature, do something where you're not keeping your brain busy. It will allows to some extent those feelings to come up to consciousness. We don't all have the luxury of seeing a therapist or um, somebody who's good at with, and not many therapists deal with trauma. It's hard to find a good one that does. You might, it's very hard, um, but we don't always have that luxury. But there's a lot of things you can do for yourself, but mostly going into yourself, becoming introspective with things like meditation helps you listen to those feelings and process them. And only in processing them, I think, can you get through the grief.
Mhm. I meditate, and much like what you said, when I first started, I was making my grocery list and my to-do list, and I found that sound helps me kind of calm my mind. So my husband actually got me a gong for Christmas, um, and honestly, it does help me because the vibration and I have my mat in front of the gong, and the vibration and the sound, it just settles me down. I don't.
I'll tell you something that's better. Binaural beats. Have you ever heard of that?
I listen to them when I
Okay.
write.
And if you have to use earphones, And it can set your brain waves to a certain level, and you can set them to a level where it makes you more alert and helps you think more clearly. But you can set them to a low level, like 2 hertz to 4 hertz, and that will put you in more of a meditative state. And
Oh, to look
you,
for some
you,
playlists.
yeah, you want to set it to the right frequency. But if you're going to go to like a higher frequency, that may help you with writing or some task where you want to just really be alert and using all your cylinders. But if you go to 2 to 4 hertz, that can put you in a meditative state. And that's helped me because, my brain is too busy, and I'm, again, your grocery list, or where are the dogs, or whatever is going to go through your mind. What am I having for dinner at that moment? It's crazy, but those binaural beats I found are good for me.
Yeah, and you can, just for our listeners, I found it's a focus playlist on Spotify. It's
Okay.
binaural for focus. So I'll have to check out the one for meditation, see if I can find a playlist on there and give it a go. Because the focus playlist, it really does bring me into a different headspace altogether.
I haven't tried the focus one. I'll have to try that.
Yeah.
I've just done the meditative ones, but I think they're great.
I wish that we could just talk for another 2 hours. This has been so fascinating, and I so appreciate your openness to talk about your life experiences and your professional experiences and the lessons that you've learned from both. Maybe we'll have to get you to come back again for a second time so we can continue our chat.
I would love to. It's really an honor to speak with you today.
Oh, thank you so much. Is there anything that you would like to leave our listeners with before we sign off?
Oh, just that connectedness. We are all much more alike than we are different. And the profound connection that we have with one another is with our humanity. And I would encourage everybody to take that to heart. And we're a lot more resilient. We're all more resilient than we know. And just love one another.
That's a beautiful message, and certainly needed in these a very different time in history we're experiencing right
now. We are, and it's very difficult. But we're all in this together.
Yes,
we all need to come together on this and do what's right, and stop the warring with each other.
I couldn't agree more with that. So if you could just tell our listeners where they can find your book and you, how we can connect to you online.
Certainly. I have a website for the book, which is Carolyn Larkin Taylor author.com. And the book is available at all your major bookstores. It's available through Amazon, Barnes and Noble. But the information for where to find that is on my website. You could just Google Whispers of the Mind, a Neurologist Memoir, and it'll pop up on Amazon. And I ask if anybody does read the book, if they would be kind enough to leave a review. That will help get the book noticed.
Absolutely. And we will have all of the links and information on how to get the book in our show notes when the episode airs.
Okay.
So thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. You have a wonderful day.
Thank you for joining me today on Broken Beautiful Me. I hope you found today's episode inspiring and insightful. Remember, every scar tells a story, and every story has the power to heal. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform so you never miss an episode. Your support means the world to me, and it helps spread the message of hope and resilience to more people like us. Don't forget to leave a review and share this podcast with your friends and family. Together, we can create a community of strength and beauty in our brokenness. Until next time, stay strong, stay beautiful, and keep shining.